As World War II ended, America faced a choice: recruit the very scientists who built Hitler's war machine, or let them fall into Soviet hands. What followed was a secret operation that shaped the Cold War, the space race, and modern science itself. This is Operation Paperclip. Operation Paperclip: How America Hired Hitler's Scientists. Vertical Bar Sleep Documentary, Part 1, Intro. Somewhere in this hallowed ground, among the heroes and patriots, lie men who once designed weapons for Adolf Hitler. Men who wore the Nazi eagle on their uniforms. Men who used concentration camp prisoners as slave labor. They died as American citizens. They were buried with military honors, and their headstones bear no indication of the lives they lived before 1945. This is the story of Operation Paperclip, a secret program that brought more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians to the United States in the years following World War II. It was, by any measure, the largest transfer of intellectual capital in human history, and it was built on a foundation of deliberate deception, moral compromise, and Cold War desperation. The name itself came from the paperclips that intelligence officers attached to the files of scientists they wanted to recruit. A simple office supply, an administrative shorthand. It became the code word for one of the most controversial decisions in American history. The men brought over through this program would help build the rockets that carried American astronauts to the moon. They would develop guidance systems for nuclear missiles. They would advance American knowledge in aviation medicine, chemical weapons, and submarine technology. Some would receive presidential commendations. Others would quietly disappear into the classified corridors of military research facilities, their work never acknowledged, their pasts never examined too closely. Tonight, we trace the complete history of Operation Paperclip, from its origins in the collapsing Third Reich to its legacy in the space age and beyond. We examine the men who were recruited, the crimes some of them committed, and the government officials who decided that winning the Cold War mattered more than justice for the dead. Origins. To understand Operation Paperclip, we must first understand what the Allies discovered as they advanced into German territory in the final months of World War II. The Third Reich, for all its military failures by 1944, possessed something the victorious powers desperately wanted. It possessed the future. For more than a decade, Nazi Germany had invested enormous resources into advanced weapons research. While American scientists worked on the atomic bomb at Los Alamos, German engineers had developed technologies that seemed to belong to another century entirely. Jet aircraft that flew faster than anything in Allied arsenals. Guided missiles that could strike targets hundreds of miles away. Rockets capable of reaching the edge of space itself. The crown jewel of this research was the A4 rocket, better known by its propaganda name, the V2, Vergeltungswaffe 2, Vengeance Weapon 2. The V2 stood 46 feet tall and weighed nearly 28,000 pounds when fully fueled. It burned a mixture of liquid oxygen and ethyl alcohol, generating 56,000 pounds of thrust. It could carry a 1-ton warhead 60 miles into the sky, arc through the upper atmosphere at speeds exceeding 3,500 miles per hour, and strike a target 200 miles away. There was no defense against it, no warning. The rocket arrived before its sound did. Between September 1944 and March 1945, Germany launched more than 3,000 V2 rockets against Allied targets. London received over 500 strikes. Antwerp, the crucial supply port for Allied forces in Europe, suffered even more. The attacks killed approximately 9,000 civilians and military personnel, but the casualties inflicted by the V2 were nothing compared to the casualties caused by its production. The rockets were manufactured in an underground factory complex called the Mittelwerk, carved into the Harz Mountains of central Germany. The workers who built them were prisoners. concentration camp inmates from a facility called Dora Mittelbau. They labored in tunnels that stretched for miles beneath the earth. They worked in conditions of almost unimaginable cruelty. They slept in the tunnels, on wooden bunks stacked 4 high, breathing air thick with rock dust and chemical fumes. They worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, assembling the intricate components of rockets designed to kill their liberators. When prisoners collapsed from exhaustion or illness, they were sent back to the main concentration camp system. When prisoners committed sabotage, or were suspected of sabotage, they were hanged from the cranes used to lift rocket assemblies, their bodies left dangling for days as a warning to others. The Mittelwerk produced approximately 6,000 V-2 rockets between August 1944 and April 1945. Historians estimate that 20,000 prisoners died in the factory and its associated camps during this period. More people died building the V-2 than were killed by its strikes. The man most responsible for this achievement was Wernher von Braun. Von Braun was 32 years old when the war ended. He had been fascinated by rockets since childhood, inspired by the science fiction of Jules Verne and the theoretical work of Hermann Oberth. He joined the Nazi Party in 1937 and the SS in 1940. He would later claim both memberships were required for his career advancement, matters of bureaucratic necessity rather than ideological conviction. Whatever his personal beliefs, von Braun became the technical director of the German Army's rocket program in 1937. He oversaw the development of the V-2 from concept to operational weapon. He visited the Mittelwerk on multiple occasions. He personally requested workers from the concentration camp system when production lagged. After the war, von Braun would become the most famous rocket scientist in the world. He would appear on the cover of Time magazine. He would collaborate with Walt Disney on television programs about space exploration. He would lead the development of the Saturn V rocket that carried American astronauts to the moon. He would receive the National Medal of Science from President Gerald Ford. But in the spring of 1945, as Allied forces closed in on Germany from east and west, Wernher von Braun faced a more immediate decision. Which army did he want to surrender to? The answer, for von Braun and most of his colleagues, was obvious. The Americans were preferable to the Soviets for reasons both practical and personal. American prisoner of war camps were known to be comparatively humane. American interrogators were unlikely to send German scientists to labor camps in Siberia. And America, with its vast industrial capacity and relative insulation from the war's destruction, offered the best prospect for continuing their research. On April 2, 1945, von Braun gathered his senior staff for a secret meeting. Germany's defeat was inevitable. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, had ordered that the rocket scientist be executed rather than allowed to fall into Allied hands. The scientists had to choose: wait for the SS to carry out these orders, flee east toward the advancing Soviet armies, or attempt to reach American lines. They chose to flee south, into the Bavarian Alps, with as much technical documentation as they could carry. They loaded 14 tons of paper, blueprints, test results, theoretical calculations, onto trucks and headed for the mountains. 3 weeks later, on May 2, 1945, Wernher von Braun's younger brother Magnus approached a private from the American 44th Infantry Division on a road near the town of Reuter, Austria. Magnus spoke passable English. He carried a message from his brother. "My name is Magnus von Braun," he said. "My brother invented the V-2. We want to surrender." The private, a young man from Wisconsin named Fred Schneikert, had no idea what to make of this claim. He brought Magnus back to his unit's headquarters, where officers quickly recognized the significance of the encounter. Within days, Wernher von Braun and approximately 120 of his colleagues were in American custody. They were the first of many, but their surrender was not part of any coordinated plan. In the spring of 1945, the United States had no formal program for recruiting German scientists. The decision to do so would emerge piecemeal, driven by military officers in the field who recognized the value of what they had captured. The legal obstacles were considerable. American immigration law contained explicit provisions barring entry to members of totalitarian parties. The Potsdam Agreement, signed by the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union in August 1945, committed all three powers to the denazification of Germany. Bringing Nazi scientists to America would violate both the letter and spirit of these commitments. But by the summer of 1945, a new concern was beginning to overshadow all others. The Soviet Union, America's wartime ally, was rapidly becoming its primary adversary, and the Soviets were conducting their own recruitment operation in the ruins of the Reich. They were offering German scientists comfortable homes, generous salaries, and continued research opportunities. They were also, when necessary, using less voluntary methods of persuasion. The race for German expertise had begun, and America could not afford to lose. Early era. The bureaucratic machinery that became Operation Paperclip emerged slowly through a series of classified directives and interagency negotiations. There was no single moment of decision, no presidential speech announcing the program's creation. The policy evolved through memoranda and meetings, through cables sent between Washington and the military occupation zones in Germany, through arguments between agencies with competing priorities and different understandings of national security. The process began in the final months of the war, when American military intelligence recognized that the collapse of Nazi Germany presented both an opportunity and a danger. The opportunity was access to advanced technology that could provide significant military advantages. The danger was that this technology might fall into Soviet hands instead. In May 1945, the Joint Chiefs of Staff authorized a program called Operation Overcast. Its stated purpose was to bring German and Austrian scientists to the United States for temporary interrogation about their wartime work. The emphasis was on temporary. The scientists would be debriefed, their knowledge extracted, and then they would be returned to Germany. No permanent immigration was contemplated. The initial list of candidates focused narrowly on specific technical fields: rocket propulsion, jet aircraft, guided missiles, chemical weapons, aviation medicine. The military services submitted names of scientists they wished to interview, and intelligence officers in Germany attempted to locate them amid the chaos of the occupation. This was not a simple task. Germany, in the summer of 1945, was a landscape of displacement and destruction. Millions of refugees moved through the ruins, seeking food and shelter, searching for lost family members, fleeing from the Soviet occupation zone to the Western zones. The scientists targeted by American intelligence were scattered across this devastation, some in hiding, some in Allied custody, some already being recruited by other nations. The British had their own program, which would eventually bring hundreds of German scientists to England. The French were actively recruiting for their atomic energy and aviation programs, and the Soviets, through a combination of inducement and coercion, were gathering thousands of German technical specialists for transport to research facilities deep inside the Soviet Union. The competition for talent intensified throughout 1945. American intelligence officers complained that bureaucratic restrictions were hampering their efforts. The requirement to return scientists to Germany after interrogation seemed increasingly impractical. The scientists themselves were reluctant to share their knowledge fully if they faced an uncertain future, and the Soviets showed no such hesitation offering permanent positions and research facilities to anyone willing to work for them. In September 1945, President Harry Truman authorized a modified program under the name Operation Paperclip. The new directive permitted the immigration of German scientists whose services were deemed essential to national security. But it contained an explicit restriction. No one who had been an active supporter of Nazi militarism could be admitted to the United States. This restriction would become the program's central contradiction. The scientists most valuable to American military research were, almost by definition, those who had been most deeply involved in Nazi weapons programs. They had risen to prominence under a regime that rewarded loyalty to the party. Many had joined the Nazi Party as a matter of career advancement. Some had joined the SS. A few had direct knowledge of or participation in war crimes. The agency responsible for screening these candidates was the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, or JIOA. It was a small office within the War Department, staffed by military officers with little experience in immigration law or Nazi ideology. Its job was to determine which scientists could be legally admitted under the Truman Directive and which could not. The JIOA faced immediate problems. The occupation authorities in Germany were compiling dossiers on suspected war criminals and Nazi party members as part of the broader denazification effort. When JIOA officers requested background files on paperclip candidates, they frequently received reports indicating that the scientists in question were ineligible for immigration. The case of Wernher von Braun was illustrative. His file noted that he had been a member of the Nazi Party since 1937 and an officer in the SS since 1940. It documented his visits to the Mittelwerk and his requests for concentration camp labor. An initial security evaluation classified him as a potential security threat who should not be admitted to the United States. Von Braun was precisely the kind of scientist the military wanted most. He was the world's leading expert on liquid-fueled rockets. He had already demonstrated his willingness to cooperate with American authorities. His knowledge was essential to the Army's nascent ballistic missile program, and he might defect to the Soviets if the Americans did not offer him a satisfactory arrangement. The JIOA decided to resolve this conflict by creating new files. The process became known informally as bleaching. Intelligence officers would review the security dossiers of paperclip candidates and remove or revise information that would disqualify them from immigration. References to Nazi Party membership were minimized or omitted. Involvement in weapons programs that used slave labor was characterized as passive or unavoidable. Statements by witnesses alleging participation in war crimes were discredited or ignored. In von Braun's case, the original security evaluation, the one that recommended denial of entry, was removed from his file and replaced with a new evaluation finding no significant security concerns. The new document described him as not a war criminal and not a threat to the security of the United States. It made no mention of the SS. Similar transformations occurred across the paperclip program. Scientists whose files documented their willing participation in Nazi activities received sanitized dossiers that portrayed them as reluctant collaborators or political innocents. The paperwork was adjusted to ensure that the desired conclusion, approval for immigration, could be reached without directly violating the Truman Directive. The State Department and the Justice Department, which shared responsibility for immigration decisions, were not informed of these practices. They received the bleached files and approved the visa applications based on the altered information. The deception was deliberate, systematic, and authorized at the highest levels of military intelligence. By the end of 1945, the first group of German scientists had arrived in the United States. Von Braun and approximately 120 of his colleagues from Peenemünde were installed at Fort Bliss, Texas, near the White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. Their official status was ambiguous. They were not prisoners of war. They were not immigrants. They held a classification created specifically for the Paperclip program, War Department Special Employees. The conditions at Fort Bliss were Spartan but adequate. The scientists lived in converted military barracks, ate in a communal mess hall, and were transported to White Sands for their work on captured V-2 rockets. They were technically under military guard, though the restrictions on their movement were loose. They could leave the base with permission. They could send and receive mail, though it was subject to censorship. They could not bring their families, who remained in Germany awaiting the resolution of their legal status. The work itself was an extension of what they had done during the war. The army had captured approximately 100 intact V-2 rockets from the Mittelwerk, along with enough spare parts to assemble many more. These rockets were shipped to White Sands for test launches, and the German scientists were tasked with assembling, fueling, and launching them. Between 1946 and 1952, the White Sands facility conducted 67 V-2 launches. Some were purely technical exercises, testing modifications to the rocket's guidance and propulsion systems. Others carried scientific instruments into the upper atmosphere, gathering data on cosmic rays, solar radiation, and the composition of the air at extreme altitudes. The V-2 program became the foundation of American rocket science, and the German scientists became indispensable participants in that foundation. The army was not the only service recruiting German expertise. The Air Force, newly established as an independent branch in 1947, maintained its own contingent of paperclip scientists at Wright Field in Ohio. Their specialty was aviation technology, jet engines, swept-wing aircraft designs, high-altitude flight medicine. The Navy brought in specialists on submarine propulsion and underwater acoustics. The Chemical Corps recruited experts in nerve agents and other toxic compounds. Each service maintained its own paperclip population, jealously guarding its scientists from competing agencies and foreign governments. The scientists themselves became assets to be protected, their value measured in the technical knowledge they possessed and the weapons they could help develop. The question of their past activities was largely set aside. The military services had decided that these men were necessary for national defense. The GIOA had provided the paperwork required for their presence, and the Cold War provided the justification for not examining the moral compromises involved too carefully. But not everyone was willing to remain silent. In 1947, reports began circulating in the American press about the backgrounds of the paperclip scientists. The Federation of American Scientists, a group that included many veterans of the Manhattan Project, publicly criticized the program as a betrayal of the war's purpose. Albert Einstein signed a petition calling for the scientists' deportation. Eleanor Roosevelt expressed her concern in her newspaper column. The War Department responded with public relations. It arranged for journalists to visit Fort Bliss and interview the scientists. It emphasized the contributions the Germans were making to American defense. It pointed out that the Soviet Union was employing far more German scientists under far less voluntary conditions, and that refusing to use their expertise would simply hand an advantage to the enemy. The controversy faded. The public had limited appetite for relitigating the moral complexities of a one war. The Cold War was beginning in earnest, and the Soviet threat seemed more immediate than the crimes of the defunct Nazi regime. The paperclip scientists continued their work. In 1948, Congress amended the immigration laws to allow the paperclip scientists and their families to enter the United States as permanent residents. The legal fiction of War Department special employees, was abandoned. The scientists became immigrants, then citizens, then Americans. Their families began arriving from Germany. Wives and children who had spent 3 years in the chaos of the occupation finally joined their husbands and fathers. The scientists moved out of military housing and into suburban homes. They sent their children to American schools. They learned to drive on American highways and shop in American stores. Wernher von Braun settled in Huntsville, Alabama, where the Army established its new rocket research facility at Redstone Arsenal. He became a fixture of the community, joining the local Lutheran church, hosting backyard barbecues for his neighbors, giving speeches to civic organizations about the promise of space exploration. He was charming, articulate, and visionary. He spoke of rockets carrying humans to the moon, of space stations orbiting the Earth, of voyages to Mars and beyond. He did not speak of the Mittelwerk. He did not speak of the prisoners who had died assembling his rockets. When journalists asked about his Nazi past, he expressed regret at having worked for a criminal regime, but he insisted that he had no choice, that his only interest had been the rockets, that he had not known the full extent of the atrocities committed in the factories and camps. Whether this was true, no one in authority seemed particularly interested in determining. The Paperclip program expanded throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s. By 1952, more than 800 German scientists and technicians had been brought to the United States. By the program's official end in 1959, the total exceeded 1,600. They worked in virtually every area of military research: rocketry, aviation, electronics, medicine, chemistry, nuclear physics. Some achieved fame. Von Braun became the public face of the American space program. Hubertus Strughold, who had overseen aviation medicine research for the Luftwaffe, became known as the father of space medicine for his work on the physiological challenges of spaceflight. Kurt Debut, another Peenemünde veteran, would eventually direct the Kennedy Space Center and oversee the launches that carried American astronauts to the moon. Others remained obscure, their work classified, their names unknown to the public. They disappeared into military laboratories and defense contractors, contributing to projects that remained secret for decades. Their files, complete with the bleached security evaluations that had allowed their entry, were locked away in government archives. The knowledge they brought was real. The moral questions they raised were deferred. And the program that had been conceived as a temporary expedient became a permanent feature of American defense research, its participants woven into the fabric of the military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower would later warn against. The story of Operation Paperclip was just beginning. The rockets would grow larger, the missiles would fly farther, the questions about the past would grow harder to ignore, and the scientists themselves would have to navigate a country that celebrated their achievements while remaining largely ignorant of the foundation on which those achievements were built. Operation Paperclip: How America Hired Hitler's Scientists, Vertical Bar, Sleep Documentary. Part 2, Rise and Peak, Crisis, Rise. The desert wind carried fine sand across the parade grounds of Fort Bliss, Texas, in the autumn of 1945. Here, in this remote corner of the American Southwest, 118 German rocket scientists began their strange new lives as guests of the United States Army. They were housed in converted hospital barracks, surrounded by chain-link fencing, their movements monitored but not restricted. They wore civilian clothes purchased from Army surplus stores. They ate in military mess halls, and they waited. Wernher von Braun, at 33 years old, emerged as their natural leader. He organized the group into working teams. He established German language classes to teach English. He created recreation schedules and assigned living quarters. The army had brought these men to America, but it had not yet decided what to do with them. Their first assignment was documentation. The army wanted every detail of V2 rocket technology extracted from their minds and committed to paper. So the Germans wrote. Day after day, week after week, they produced technical reports covering propulsion systems, guidance mechanisms, fuel chemistry, structural engineering, and launch procedures. By December 1945, they had generated over 3,000 pages of documentation. They called themselves prisoners of peace in their private conversations. They were not prisoners in any legal sense, yet they could not leave the base without escort. They could not contact family members in Germany without military censorship. They existed in a bureaucratic limbo between enemy and employee. The first V2 test launch on American soil occurred on April 16, 1946, at the White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. The rocket rose from the desert floor at 3:25 in the afternoon, climbing on a pillar of orange flame. It reached an altitude of 60 miles before its engine cut out. It descended, tumbling, and crashed into the sand 31 miles north of the launch site. The test was deemed a partial success. The rocket had flown. The Germans had proven their value. Over the following months, the pace of launches increased. May brought 2 more flights. June brought 3. The scientists worked to adapt captured German rockets to American instrumentation. They trained American engineers in the intricacies of liquid fuel propulsion. They solved problems that had taken them years to understand in Germany, transmitting knowledge that would otherwise have required decades to develop independently. The expansion of Operation Paperclip proceeded in parallel with these technical achievements. Colonel Holger Toftoy, now commanding the rocket program at Fort Bliss, repeatedly requested additional German personnel. The original 118 specialists lacked sufficient support staff. They needed draftsmen, machinists, technicians, and junior engineers. In Germany, a procurement team continued searching displaced persons camps and interviewing candidates. By the end of 1946, the Paperclip roster had grown to 214 individuals. By 1947, it exceeded 300. By 1948, over 400 German specialists worked for various American military and civilian agencies. The program had expanded far beyond rocketry to encompass aviation medicine, submarine technology, chemical weapons research, and electronic warfare systems. The bureaucratic machinery supporting this expansion grew increasingly sophisticated. Within the Pentagon, a dedicated Paperclip office coordinated between military services, intelligence agencies, and the State Department. Standard procedures emerged for processing new arrivals, medical examinations at military hospitals, security interviews at classified facilities, housing assignments at approved locations, employment contracts specifying duties, compensation, and restrictions. The legal framework remained improvised. German specialists entered the country under a provision of the Immigration Act, allowing temporary admission for purposes of national security. Their visas required renewal every 6 months. They could not apply for permanent residency. They could not bring family members to America. They existed in a perpetual state of temporary status, valuable enough to import, but not valuable enough to fully accept. This legal uncertainty created constant anxiety among the Germans. They had abandoned their homeland. They had placed their futures in American hands. Yet America offered no guarantee of permanence. Any individual could theoretically be returned to Germany at any time. The Soviet occupation zone loomed as a threat. The war crimes tribunals at Nuremberg continued their work. Several Paperclip participants had reason to fear investigation. The case of Arthur Rudolph illustrated these tensions. Rudolph had served as production manager at the Mittelwerk underground factory where V2 rockets were assembled using concentration camp labor. Thousands of prisoners had died in those tunnels from overwork, starvation, and execution. Rudolph's OMGUS security evaluation noted his membership in the Nazi Party since 1931. It documented his position at Mittelwerk. It recorded allegations of direct involvement in selecting prisoners for punishment. Yet Rudolph's technical expertise made him indispensable. He understood rocket production systems. He knew how to organize assembly lines, coordinate supply chains, manage quality control. The army needed this knowledge, so his security file was amended. References to his Nazi Party membership were minimized. His Mittelwerk service was characterized as technical rather than supervisory. He received clearance to continue working on classified projects. This pattern repeated across the program. Scientists with problematic backgrounds found their records softened, their Nazi affiliations downplayed, their potential war crimes overlooked. The process was not random. It reflected deliberate decisions by intelligence officers who weighed technical value against moral culpability and consistently chose technical value. In September 1946, President Truman quietly extended Operation Paperclip's authorization. The original directive had permitted importation of German specialists for a period not exceeding 1 year. Now the program would continue indefinitely. The president's military advisors had convinced him that Soviet technical advances posed a genuine threat. German expertise remained essential to national defense. The program would not only continue, but expand. The expansion brought new categories of specialists. Aviation medicine researchers arrived from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. Their expertise derived from experiments conducted on concentration camp prisoners at Dachau. Submarine engineers arrived from the Kriegsmarine. Their knowledge came from vessels that had sunk thousands of Allied ships. Chemical weapons experts arrived from IG, Farben. Their research had been conducted in facilities adjacent to Auschwitz. Hubertus Strughold became the most controversial figure in this second wave of arrivals. He was Germany's leading aviation physiologist, director of the Luftwaffe's Aeromedical Research Institute in Berlin. His subordinates had conducted experiments at Dachau, submerging prisoners in ice water to study hypothermia, locking them in pressure chambers to simulate high-altitude conditions. Dozens had died. Strughold's direct involvement in these experiments remained unclear, but his institutional responsibility was undeniable. The army brought Strughold to Texas in 1947. He took charge of the newly established School of Aviation Medicine at Randolph Field in San Antonio. He trained a generation of American aerospace physicians. He pioneered research on the effects of spaceflight on the human body. He became known as the father of space medicine. His Nazi-era research was not discussed. The rocket program achieved its first major expansion in late 1949. The Army announced plans to relocate the German team from Fort Bliss to a new facility in Huntsville, Alabama. The Redstone Arsenal offered larger testing grounds, better manufacturing facilities, and a more permanent institutional home. The move signaled a shift from experimentation to production. America was building a rocket program to last. Von Braun and his team arrived in Huntsville in April 1950. They found a small southern city of 16,000 people surrounded by cotton fields and tenant farms. The arsenal itself sprawled across 40,000 acres of former farmland, acquired during the war for chemical weapons production. Vacant buildings awaited conversion to rocket laboratories. Empty test stands awaited modification for new engines. The Germans settled into the Huntsville community with remarkable speed. They purchased homes in quiet neighborhoods. They enrolled their children in public schools. They joined civic organizations, attended local churches, organized concerts and lectures. Von Braun became a visible public figure, speaking to Rotary clubs and Chamber of Commerce meetings about the future of spaceflight. He was charming, articulate, photogenic. The local newspaper called him the most famous citizen of Huntsville. By this time, the legal status of the paperclip specialists had finally stabilized. A 1947 amendment to the Immigration Act created a pathway to permanent residency for individuals whose presence served the national interest. Over the following years, most German scientists obtained green cards. Some applied for citizenship. The temporary visitors were becoming permanent residents. The war-era enemies were becoming American neighbors. The outbreak of the Korean War in June 1950 transformed the strategic context of Operation Paperclip. Suddenly, the Cold War had turned hot. Communist forces were fighting American troops on Asian battlefields. The Soviet threat had materialized into actual combat. Every advantage in weapons technology became urgent rather than theoretical. The Huntsville team received orders to accelerate development of a new rocket, designated the Redstone. This would be the first American ballistic missile designed from inception rather than adapted from captured German technology. It would carry a nuclear warhead. It would strike targets 200 miles distant. It would provide the army with a weapon system that could influence the strategic balance. The Redstone design drew heavily on V2 principles, but incorporated significant advances. Von Braun's team developed new propulsion systems using ethyl alcohol and liquid oxygen. They engineered more reliable guidance mechanisms using improved gyroscopes. They designed structural components from aluminum alloy rather than steel, reducing weight while maintaining strength. The missile would be faster, more accurate, and more powerful than anything the Germans had built during the war. This work proceeded in parallel with expansion of the paperclip network. By 1952, over 900 German specialists worked for American military and civilian agencies. They were scattered across the country, assigned to facilities in California, Ohio, Maryland, New Mexico, and Alabama. They worked on projects ranging from guided missiles to jet engines to nerve gas antidotes. The original 118 rocket scientists had become the nucleus of a vast technical workforce. The integration of these individuals into American scientific institutions proceeded with minimal friction. They published papers in American journals. They attended conferences alongside American colleagues. They trained graduate students at American universities. The boundaries between occupier and occupied, between victor and vanquished, between enemy and ally, had dissolved into professional collaboration. Some American scientists objected. Albert Einstein refused to meet with former Nazi researchers. He publicly questioned the morality of importing individuals who had served a genocidal regime. But Einstein's objections received limited attention. The strategic imperative overrode ethical concerns. The Cold War demanded weapons, and weapons demanded expertise, regardless of its origin. Peak crisis. The first Redstone missile lifted off from Cape Canaveral, Florida at 9:47 in the morning on August 20th, 1953. It rose smoothly from the launch pad, accelerating through the humid Florida air on 69,000 pounds of thrust. The engine burned for 121 seconds, consuming 400 gallons of fuel per second. The missile reached an altitude of 58 miles. It traveled 130 miles downrange. It splashed into the Atlantic Ocean precisely where the guidance calculations had predicted. In Huntsville, the German team celebrated quietly. 8 years after arriving in America as temporary visitors, they had delivered their first fully American weapon system. The Redstone represented vindication of the entire paperclip enterprise. These former enemies had earned their place in the American defense establishment. Yet the Redstone achievement occurred against a backdrop of mounting controversy. Throughout the early 1950s, journalists and activists had begun investigating the backgrounds of paperclip scientists. The war crimes trials at Nuremberg had concluded. but public awareness of Nazi atrocities had increased rather than diminished. Questions arose about how thoroughly the Americans had screened their German imports. In November 1952, columnist Drew Pearson published a series of articles alleging that known Nazi war criminals had been brought to America under paperclip protection. He named specific individuals. He cited their party memberships, their SS affiliations, their positions in organizations responsible for slave labor and human experimentation. The articles generated significant public attention. The response from military authorities followed a predictable pattern. Spokesmen acknowledged that some paperclip scientists had been nominal Nazi party members, as required for professional advancement in Germany. They denied that any genuine war criminals had been imported. They emphasized the security screening procedures, the OMG US evaluations, the careful vetting of each individual. They insisted that national security concerns justified the program. Behind closed doors, officials recognized the vulnerability of these claims. The OMG US evaluations had been superficial. The security screenings had been conducted by officers more interested in technical expertise than moral history. The decision to minimize or suppress damaging information had been systematic rather than exceptional. If journalists obtained access to original files, the entire program could face devastating exposure. The army responded by restricting access to paperclip documentation. Files were reclassified. Distribution lists were narrowed. Storage locations were changed. The bureaucratic apparatus that had facilitated the program now worked to conceal its more troubling details. Information that might embarrass the government disappeared into classified archives, unavailable to journalists, historians, or congressional investigators. This concealment proved largely effective. Public attention faded. The Pearson articles generated brief controversy, but no sustained investigation. Congress held no hearings. No prosecutions resulted. The German scientists continued their work. The program continued its expansion. By the mid-1950s, Wernher von Braun had achieved a remarkable transformation of public image. He was no longer merely a military contractor working in obscurity. He had become America's most famous advocate for space exploration. His articles appeared in Collier's magazine, reaching millions of readers with detailed visions of space stations, lunar expeditions, and Martian colonies. His face appeared on the cover of Time magazine. His voice reached television audiences through appearances on news programs and variety shows. The partnership with Walt Disney represented the pinnacle of this public relations campaign. In 1955, Disney produced a series of television programs about spaceflight, featuring von Braun as primary technical expert. Man in Space aired on March 9, 1955, drawing an audience of 42 million viewers. Von Braun appeared on screen, explaining rocket principles with models and animation, describing the technical requirements for reaching orbit, painting vivid pictures of humanity's future among the stars. The Disney programs never mentioned von Braun's past. They did not discuss the V-2 rockets that had killed thousands of civilians in London and Antwerp. They did not acknowledge the slave laborers who had died building those rockets in underground factories. They presented the German scientist as a visionary dreamer, a man whose genius would carry humanity to the heavens. The transformation was complete. The former SS officer had become an American hero. Not everyone accepted this rehabilitation. Certain Jewish organizations quietly maintained files on paperclip scientists and their wartime activities. Some survivors of Nazi persecution recognized names from their own experiences. Occasional articles in smaller publications raised questions about sanitized biographies and concealed histories. But these voices remained marginal, overwhelmed by the dominant narrative of German scientific genius serving American strategic interests. The Soviet launch of Sputnik on October 4, 1957, transformed the American space program from strategic asset to national obsession. An 83-kilogram sphere orbited the Earth every 96 minutes, its radio signals audible to amateur receivers across the globe. The Soviet Union had achieved what von Braun had been promising for years. America had fallen behind. The political reaction was immediate and intense. President Eisenhower faced accusations of negligence. Congress demanded explanations. Editorial pages warned of technological inferiority. The public mood shifted from confidence to anxiety. If the Soviets could launch satellites, they could launch nuclear weapons. The space race had begun, and America was losing. For the Paperclip scientists, Sputnik represented both vindication and frustration. Von Braun had been proposing satellite launches for years. His Redstone rocket possessed sufficient capability. His team had developed preliminary designs, but military bureaucracy and inter-service rivalry had blocked progress. The Navy's Vanguard program had received satellite priority while the Army rocket team waited. On December 6, 1957, the Vanguard rocket exploded on its launch pad at Cape Canaveral. Millions of television viewers watched the fireball rise from the Florida coast. The satellite payload tumbled to the ground, its radio transmitter beeping pathetically amid the wreckage. Newspapers called it Flopnik and Kaputnik. The humiliation was total. The Army rocket team received authorization to attempt a satellite launch within days of the Vanguard failure. Von Braun had been waiting for this moment. His Jupiter C rocket, a modified Redstone, stood ready at Cape Canaveral. His team worked through the holidays, checking systems, running simulations, preparing for the attempt that would define their American careers. The launch occurred at 10:48 p.m. Eastern Time on January 31, 1958. The Jupiter C rose from Pad 26A, carrying the Explorer 1 satellite. Unlike the public spectacle of Vanguard, this launch was restricted to military personnel and essential staff. Von Braun waited in Washington, D.C. at the Pentagon Communications Center. His team monitored from the Cape Canaveral blockhouse. For 90 minutes after launch, no one knew whether the satellite had reached orbit. At 12:45 a.m. on February 1st, tracking stations in California confirmed the signal. Explorer 1 was in orbit. America had entered the space age. Von Braun held an impromptu press conference, hoisting a model of the satellite above his head while flashbulbs exploded around him. The photograph appeared on front pages across the country the following morning. The former Nazi rocket engineer had become the man who saved American honor. The political and institutional consequences of Explorer 1 proved profound. Within months, Congress created the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. The new civilian agency would coordinate American space efforts outside military channels. Von Braun and his Huntsville team transferred from Army Command to NASA administration. Their mission expanded from weapons development to human spaceflight. The transition to NASA brought the Paperclip scientists fully into the American mainstream. They were no longer military contractors operating under security restrictions. They were civilian employees of a peacetime agency dedicated to exploration and discovery. Their work would be public. Their achievements would carry American prestige. Their faces would represent American technological ambition to audiences around the world. The Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville became von Braun's domain. He served as director from 1960 to 1970, overseeing development of the rockets that would carry Americans to the moon. The former German military facility became the heart of American space exploration. The former German military scientists became the engineers of American destiny. Yet beneath this triumphant narrative, troubling questions remained unresolved. The origins of Paperclip had never been publicly acknowledged in full. the manipulation of security files had never been officially admitted. The moral compromises underlying the entire enterprise had never been seriously examined. The American space program was built on foundations that its leaders preferred not to discuss. Individual cases continued to surface, disturbing the smooth narrative of technical achievement. In 1958, investigators discovered that Hubertus Strughold's wartime subordinates had conducted fatal experiments on concentration camp prisoners. Strughold's own role remained ambiguous, but his institutional responsibility was clear. Yet NASA retained him. His expertise was too valuable to sacrifice for historical accountability. Kurt Debue, who directed launch operations at Cape Canaveral, had been an active Nazi Party member and SA officer. His enthusiasm for the regime had been noted in wartime evaluations. Yet he oversaw every major American space launch of the 1960s. His past was simply not discussed in official biographies. Georg Ricci, operations manager at the Mittelwerk factory, where thousands of slave laborers had died, was actually extradited and tried for war crimes in 1947. He was acquitted for lack of evidence, though the evidence against him had been deliberately suppressed by army officials who wanted to continue using his expertise. He returned to America and resumed work on classified projects. These individual cases represented a systemic pattern. The United States government had made a calculated decision to prioritize technical advantage over moral accountability. The decision was not secret, but neither was it openly debated. It occurred incrementally, through countless bureaucratic choices that individually seemed reasonable, but collectively amounted to a fundamental compromise of stated American values. The peak of Paperclip's achievement came with the Apollo program. The Saturn V rocket that carried astronauts to the moon was designed by von Braun's team at Marshall Space Flight Center. The former V-2 engineers calculated the trajectories, specified the propellants, designed the engines, and supervised the construction. When Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface on July 20, 1969, he completed a journey that began in the bombed laboratories of wartime Germany. The celebration of Apollo 11 marked the symbolic culmination of the Paperclip enterprise. The German scientists had delivered on their implicit bargain. They had provided America with technological supremacy over the Soviet Union. They had transformed their former enemy into the leading power in human spaceflight. They had earned their American lives. Yet as the celebration faded, new questions began to emerge. A new generation of journalists and historians had come of age after the war. They possessed no personal stake in concealing wartime compromises. They had access to documents that earlier researchers could not obtain. They began investigating the backgrounds of America's space heroes with fresh eyes and different priorities. The Freedom of Information Act, enacted in 1966, created new possibilities for obtaining classified documents. Researchers filed requests for Paperclip files. Lawyers demanded access to security evaluations. Archivists located records that officials had assumed were safely buried. The concealment apparatus that had protected the German scientists began to crack. By the early 1970s, the first comprehensive studies of Operation Paperclip began to appear. Clarence Lasby's Project Paperclip, published in 1971, provided the first academic account based on primary documents. It revealed the systematic manipulation of security files. It documented the knowing importation of individuals with serious Nazi backgrounds. It challenged the official narrative of careful vetting and democratic oversight. The media attention that followed created genuine crisis for surviving Paperclip participants. Arthur Rudolph, now a senior NASA official, faced renewed scrutiny of his Mittelwerk service. Hubertus Strughold's connections to Dachau experiments resurfaced in newspaper articles. Kurt Debus's Nazi Party activities became subjects of investigative reporting. The carefully constructed American identities of the German scientists began to unravel. The congressional response was slow, but eventually substantial. In 1974, Representative Elizabeth Holtzman introduced legislation requiring deportation of Nazi war criminals residing in the United States. The Office of Special Investigations, created within the Justice Department in 1979, began systematic review of naturalized citizens who had concealed wartime atrocities. For the first time, the legal immunities that had protected Paperclip scientists faced formal challenge. Arthur Rudolph's case became the test of this new accountability regime. Investigators compiled evidence of his direct supervision of slave labor at Mittelwerk. They documented his role in requesting prisoner workers from concentration camps. They established his personal involvement in punishing laborers deemed insufficiently productive. In 1984, facing deportation proceedings, Rudolph surrendered his American citizenship and returned to Germany. He was the first Paperclip scientist to face legal consequences for wartime conduct. Operation Paperclip: How America Hired Hitler's Scientists, Vertical Bar Sleep Documentary, Part 3, Aftermath. The paperwork moved through channels designed to obscure rather than illuminate. By the autumn of 1947, the program that would eventually be known as Operation Paperclip had achieved a kind of bureaucratic permanence that its original architects had never anticipated. What began as a temporary measure to exploit German scientific knowledge for the final push against Japan had transformed into something far more enduring. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, operating from offices within the Pentagon's newly constructed corridors, processed applications with increasing efficiency. The system had found its rhythm. The military's appetite for German expertise seemed to grow with each passing month. Initial estimates that perhaps a few dozen specialists might prove useful gave way to requests for hundreds, then thousands. By the end of 1947, the program had brought more than 1,700 German and Austrian scientists, engineers, and technicians to American soil. Each arrival represented a calculated decision by military officials that the individual's potential contributions outweighed whatever concerns might arise from their wartime activities. The calculations were rarely made public. The State Department objected repeatedly. Diplomats understood what military planners sometimes failed to grasp, that perception mattered in the emerging post-war order. The United States had positioned itself as the moral leader of the free world, the nation that had liberated Europe from fascism. How would it appear if word spread that America was quietly importing the very scientists who had armed that fascism? The State Department's concerns were noted in meeting minutes and filed appropriately. The program continued. Vice Consul Samuel Klaus at the State Department compiled detailed reports documenting what he viewed as systematic violations of immigration law. His memos, preserved in government archives, reveal a bureaucrat increasingly frustrated by his own irrelevance. Klaus documented cases where individuals with clear Nazi Party membership had their records altered to remove such references. He tracked instances where scientists who had employed concentration camp labor were described in their files as mere technical specialists with no political affiliations. His reports circulated through proper channels. They changed nothing. The German scientists themselves adapted to their new circumstances with varying degrees of success. At White Sands, the rocket team settled into a routine that would have been familiar from Peenemünde. Long hours of technical work interrupted by bureaucratic frustrations and the occasional spectacular failure. The desert provided privacy that European facilities never could. Failed rocket tests vanished into empty scrubland rather than populated countryside. The isolation that some found oppressive, others viewed as liberating. Wernher von Braun emerged as the unofficial spokesman for the group, his fluent English and natural charisma making him invaluable for congressional briefings and press interviews. He learned quickly how to present the German contribution in terms Americans found palatable. The V2 became a technical achievement rather than a weapon of terror. The use of concentration camp labor became a tragedy we could not prevent. Von Braun understood that Americans wanted to believe they had acquired not former enemies, but future allies. He gave them reasons to believe. The first successful American launch of a captured V2 rocket occurred on December 17, 1946. The missile rose from the New Mexico desert, trailing smoke and fire, climbing to an altitude of 116 miles before plunging back to Earth. American newspapers reported the achievement as a triumph of American engineering. The German scientists who had designed, built, and launched the rocket watched from a safe distance. Their contributions went largely unmentioned in public accounts. This pattern would repeat throughout the early years of the program. American institutions took credit for achievements that relied heavily on German expertise. The scientists themselves generally accepted this arrangement without complaint. They understood the political sensitivities involved. They also understood that their continued presence in America depended on remaining useful while remaining invisible. Public recognition would come later, if at all. The paperclip itself had long since been removed from most files, but the name persisted as an informal designation within intelligence circles. By 1948, Operation Paperclip had become semi-official terminology, used in internal memoranda and budget requests. The name captured something essential about the program's improvised nature. These were not carefully vetted immigrants following established procedures. They were expedient solutions to immediate problems, attached to the American system with whatever administrative fastener happened to be at hand. The vetting process, such as it was, operated on principles that prioritized utility over morality. Joint intelligence objectives. Agency officers were not investigators in any meaningful sense. They were talent scouts. Their job was to identify individuals with skills America needed and to facilitate their transfer. Questions about wartime conduct were asked, but the answers mattered less than the asking. An applicant who could plausibly deny direct involvement in atrocities generally received approval. The burden of proof rested entirely on those who might object to an individual's admission, not on the applicant themselves. Not everyone remained silent. Albert Einstein, the most famous scientific refugee from Nazi Germany, watched the influx of his former countrymen with undisguised disgust. In letters to friends and colleagues, Einstein condemned what he viewed as American moral cowardice. "These Germans," he wrote in one such letter, "were enthusiastic Nazis who exploited slave labor, and now they are rewarded with American citizenship." Einstein refused to meet with any of the paperclip scientists, even those who sought his endorsement for their work. His opposition, while noted in the press, failed to generate sustained public outcry. The reasons for this public indifference were multiple. Americans in 1948 were tired of war and its moral complexities. The emerging Cold War provided new enemies to worry about and new contexts for evaluating old enemies. Soviet aggression in Eastern Europe, the Berlin blockade, the steady expansion of communist influence, these concerns made German scientists seem less like former adversaries and more like potential allies against a greater threat. The enemy of my enemy, as the old saying went. Congressional oversight, when it occurred, tended toward the perfunctory. The House Armed Services Committee held hearings in 1949 that touched on the program's operations, but members showed little appetite for rigorous investigation. The questions posed to military witnesses often seemed designed to elicit reassuring answers rather than uncomfortable truths. Yes, the witnesses confirmed, all German scientists underwent thorough background checks. Yes, any individuals with significant Nazi affiliations were excluded. Yes, the program operated within existing legal frameworks. The congressman nodded and moved on to other matters. This institutional reluctance to probe too deeply reflected broader political realities. The program had powerful supporters within the military establishment, men whose careers and budgets depended on access to German expertise. These supporters ensured that potential critics understood the costs of opposition. A congressman who questioned the program's ethics might find his district's military contracts suddenly under review. A journalist who dug too deeply might lose access to defense sources. The mechanisms of influence operated quietly but effectively. The Soviet atomic test of August 29, 1949, transformed the political landscape overnight. American monopoly on nuclear weapons, always understood as temporary, ended earlier than most experts had predicted. Suddenly, the arguments for exploiting every possible scientific advantage gained new urgency. Critics of Operation Paperclip found their objections drowned out by calls for greater mobilization of scientific resources. Whatever qualms Americans might have about hiring former Nazis, those qualms seemed abstract compared to the concrete threat of Soviet nuclear attack. The timing proved crucial for the program's survival. Just as questions about ethical compromises might have gained political traction, the Cold War provided overwhelming justification for continued operations. National security trumped all other considerations. The scientists were needed. Their pasts were inconvenient, but manageable. The paperwork could always be adjusted. The geographical distribution of Paperclip scientists expanded throughout the late 1940s. While White Sands remained the primary center for rocket research, other installations absorbed specialists in aeronautics, electronics, chemical warfare, and biological weapons. Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio became a major hub for aviation expertise. Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland housed chemical weapons specialists. Fort Detrick, also in Maryland, employed microbiologists whose wartime work had involved biological agents of various kinds. Each facility developed its own culture regarding the German presence. Some commanders welcomed the expertise and integrated German specialists fully into their operations. Others maintained careful distance, using the Germans as consultants while keeping them separate from sensitive work. The variations reflected individual judgments about risk and reward, security and utility. No uniform policy existed because no uniform consensus had emerged about what these men represented. The Korean War, beginning in June of 1950, accelerated trends already in motion. Military budgets expanded dramatically. Research and development programs that had struggled for funding suddenly found themselves flush with resources. The German scientists discovered that their value had increased along with the geopolitical stakes. Projects that had moved slowly now operated under urgent timelines. The leisurely adaptation of wartime German technology gave way to crash programs aimed at developing entirely new weapons systems. Wernher von Braun recognized the opportunity and positioned himself accordingly. His proposals for advanced rocket systems found receptive audiences in the Pentagon. The disasters of the V-2 program, the slave labor, the civilian deaths, the fundamental immorality of the enterprise, faded into background noise. What mattered now was capability. Von Braun had it. America wanted it. The transaction proceeded on terms favorable to both parties. The relocation to Huntsville, Alabama, began in 1950 and represented a new phase in the program's evolution. The Army's Ordnance-Guided Missile Center offered facilities specifically designed for advanced rocket development. More importantly, Huntsville offered permanence. The German scientists were no longer temporary visitors, but establishing families in American communities. They purchased homes, enrolled children in schools, joined churches and civic organizations. The process of becoming American, begun tentatively in El Paso and White Sands, accelerated in the Alabama town that would come to be known as Rocket City. The locals adjusted to their new neighbors with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some welcomed the economic benefits the missile program brought to their previously quiet community. Others harbored suspicions about the foreigners with their strange accents and unfamiliar customs. A few vocal critics questioned the wisdom of settling former enemy scientists in their midst. These objections diminished over time as the Germans proved themselves unremarkable neighbors, attending football games, hosting backyard barbecues, complaining about the weather like everyone else. The path to American citizenship opened formally in 1955. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952 had created new frameworks for naturalization, and paperclip scientists began applying in significant numbers. The applications required them to swear that they had never been members of organizations advocating totalitarian government. Many swore falsely, their actual Nazi Party memberships having been expunged from official records years earlier. The fraud was systematic and institutionally sanctioned. The naturalization ceremonies took place in courtrooms across the country, ordinary proceedings indistinguishable from thousands of others. German scientists raised their right hands and pledged allegiance to the Constitution of the United States. They renounced foreign sovereignties and declared their intention to support and defend their new nation. Judges welcomed them as fellow citizens. The transformations were complete on paper. The men who had designed weapons for Adolf Hitler were now Americans. Legacy. The Vehicle Assembly Building at Kennedy Space Center stands 525 feet tall, one of the largest buildings by volume in the world. Inside this structure, engineers assembled the Saturn V rockets that carried American astronauts to the moon. The design principles embedded in those rockets trace directly to the work of German scientists brought to America through Operation Paperclip. Every Apollo mission that lifted off from Cape Canaveral carried within its engineering DNA decisions made decades earlier at Peenemünde, refined in the New Mexico desert, and perfected in the Alabama workshops overseen by Wernher von Braun. The space program represents the most visible legacy of Paperclip, the achievement most often cited when defenders of the program seek to justify its moral compromises. 12 Americans walked on the lunar surface between 1969 and 1972. They traveled there aboard rockets designed by men who had once served Adolf Hitler. The question of whether those achievements excuse or merely complicate the program's origins remains contested more than half a century later. Von Braun's personal trajectory illustrates both the possibilities and the contradictions of post-war reinvention. By the early 1960s, he had become one of the most famous scientists in America, his face appearing on magazine covers and his voice heard on television explaining the wonders of space exploration. Walt Disney featured him in educational programs about rocketry. President Kennedy consulted him on the nation's lunar ambitions. The former SS officer had achieved respectability that would have seemed impossible in the immediate post-war years. Yet the past never entirely disappeared. Journalists occasionally raised uncomfortable questions about his wartime activities. Survivors of the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp, where V2 components were manufactured using slave labor, demanded accountability that never came. Von Braun developed a standard response to such inquiries, expressing regret for the suffering that occurred while deflecting personal responsibility onto the Nazi system as a whole. He had been a scientist focused on technical problems, he insisted, not a political actor with meaningful choices. The explanation satisfied most Americans most of the time. The narrative that emerged from this careful public relations effort shaped how Americans understood the relationship between science, morality, and national interest. The Paperclip scientists became characters in a story about American ingenuity overcoming obstacles, about the peaceful uses of wartime technology, about redemption through achievement. The museums that display their work generally adopt this framework. The interpretive panels explain technical specifications and historical firsts. The human costs that made those achievements possible receive considerably less attention. This selective memory represents a form of institutional legacy as significant as any rocket engine. The United States learned through Operation Paperclip that moral compromises could be managed through careful framing. Inconvenient facts could be classified, delayed, or simply ignored until they faded from public consciousness. The officials who ran the program discovered that Americans, given sufficient reason to look away, would generally do so. These lessons proved valuable in subsequent decades. The past caught up with some participants eventually. In 1985, the Department of Justice opened an investigation into Arthur Rudolph, who had served as production manager at the Mittelbau-Dora factory during the war and later directed development of the Saturn V rocket. The Office of Special Investigations, established to identify Nazi war criminals living in the United States, had received evidence that Rudolph bore direct responsibility for the brutal conditions that killed thousands of slave laborers. Rather than face denaturalization proceedings, Rudolph voluntarily surrendered his American citizenship and returned to Germany. He never faced criminal charges. The German government determined that insufficient evidence existed for prosecution. Rudolph spent his remaining years in Hamburg, bitter about what he viewed as unjust persecution. His departure represented a rare instance of accountability for Paperclip participants, though even this outcome fell far short of what victims and their advocates had sought. The documentary record of Operation Paperclip began emerging from classified status in the 1980s and 90s. The Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act of 1998 mandated review and release of government records related to war criminals and their activities. Researchers gained access to files that revealed the systematic nature of the program's ethical violations, the falsified records, the ignored warnings, the deliberate decisions to prioritize utility over accountability. These disclosures prompted renewed scholarly attention to the program's history. Journalists and historians published detailed accounts based on previously unavailable sources. The mythology of German scientists as political technicians gave way to more nuanced portraits of individuals who had made choices, often immoral choices, within the Nazi system. The question of their subsequent American careers became not whether they had valuable knowledge, but whether that knowledge justified overlooking how it had been acquired. Annie Jacobsen's 2014 book, Operation Paperclip, the secret intelligence program that brought Nazi scientists to America, brought the story to a new generation of readers. Drawing on extensive archival research and interviews with family members of participants, Jacobsen documented the program in unprecedented detail. Her work reached mainstream audiences who had encountered only fragmentary accounts previously. The book's commercial success indicated public appetite for understanding this chapter of Cold War history. Other scholars focused on specific aspects of the program's operations. Studies examined the medical experiments conducted by Paperclip scientists, some of which built directly on research performed in concentration camps. Investigations traced the careers of chemical and biological weapons specialists, whose wartime work had involved human subjects under conditions no ethical review board would approve. Each study added texture to the emerging picture of a program far more morally complex than official accounts had suggested. The institutional legacy extends beyond any individual program or set of scientists. Operation Paperclip established templates for how the United States government handles ethical dilemmas in intelligence and national security contexts. The arguments deployed to justify hiring former Nazis, necessity, exceptional circumstances, the greater good, recur in subsequent controversies over torture, surveillance, and covert operations. The vocabulary of expedients developed during Paperclip remains in active use. Contemporary debates about accountability for human rights violations by foreign actors frequently invoke Paperclip as precedent. When American officials consider whether to work with foreign intelligence services implicated in abuses, they operate within frameworks established during the immediate post-war period. The fundamental question, whether useful knowledge or capabilities can be cleanly separated from the moral character of those who possess them, remains as contested now as it was in 1945. The question of how to honor Paperclip participants continues to generate controversy. In 2010, NASA dedicated a building at Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville to Wernher von Braun. The ceremony acknowledged his contributions to the space program while generating renewed debate about whether such recognition was appropriate given his wartime activities. Critics argued that naming buildings after individuals implicated in mass atrocity sent troubling messages about institutional values. Defenders maintained that his American career deserved recognition on its own terms. Similar controversies have surrounded other forms of commemoration. Schools and streets named after Paperclip scientists face periodic calls for renaming. Statues and memorials prompt debates about historical memory and public values. These disputes reflect broader societal arguments about how to acknowledge complicated legacies, how to recognize genuine achievements while also confronting the moral failures that accompanied them. The contemporary space industry operates on foundations laid by Paperclip scientists, even as it moves beyond their technical frameworks. Companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin pursue ambitions that von Braun articulated decades ago: reusable rockets, commercial space travel, eventual human settlement beyond Earth. The engineers who design these systems study the same principles of propulsion and guidance that the German team developed at Peenemünde and refined in America. The lineage is direct even when unacknowledged, yet the industry has also developed new ethical frameworks that would have been unfamiliar to the Paperclip generation. Contemporary aerospace companies operate under legal and regulatory structures that mandate transparency about employment practices and supply chains. They face scrutiny from shareholders, journalists, and advocacy groups that earlier programs never experienced. Whether these mechanisms would prevent a future Paperclip remains uncertain, but they represent institutional learning from past failures. The intelligence community absorbed lessons from Paperclip that extended beyond any specific scientific capability. The program demonstrated that American security services could manage complex, ethically fraught operations across multiple government agencies with minimal public awareness or oversight. The techniques of classification, compartmentalization, and bureaucratic obfuscation proved highly effective. Subsequent programs would employ similar methods to shield controversial activities from scrutiny. This operational inheritance shaped Cold War intelligence practices in ways that persist today. The CIA's use of former Nazi intelligence officers in operations against the Soviet Union followed patterns established by Paperclip. The military's willingness to overlook the backgrounds of foreign collaborators in exchange for useful capabilities drew on precedents set during the immediate post-war scramble for German expertise. The fundamental premise that national security justifies ethical compromises invisible to the public became embedded in institutional culture. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, which opened in 1993 on the National Mall in Washington, includes materials related to Operation Paperclip in its archives and occasional exhibitions. The museum's mission to document and educate about the Holocaust necessarily encompasses the post-war period when perpetrators escaped justice, or in the case of Paperclip scientists, found new careers in the countries that had defeated Nazi Germany. This juxtaposition, memory of victims alongside documentation of how victimizers fared, captures something essential about the program's place in historical consciousness. Visitors to the museum encounter the Holocaust primarily as a story of systematic murder and its victims. But they also learn about the structures that made such murder possible, the bureaucracies, the industries, the scientific establishments that contributed expertise and labor to the Nazi project. The Paperclip scientists occupied positions within these structures. Their subsequent American careers cannot be understood apart from their earlier German ones, however much the officials who recruited them wished to treat the two as separate. The participants themselves have passed from the scene. The last known Paperclip scientist died in 2006, closing the possibility of further testimonies or accountability proceedings directed at program participants themselves. What remains are documents, artifacts, and contested memories. The generation that made decisions about hiring former Nazis has been succeeded by generations that must decide how to interpret and respond to those decisions. The moral questions have outlived those who created them. The investigations that did occur, the Rudolph case, various journalistic exposés, congressional inquiries that touched on Paperclip tangentially, never produced the comprehensive reckoning that critics demanded. No official body has ever concluded that the program was a mistake or that those who ran it acted wrongfully. The closest approach came in 2005, when the National Archives released files confirming many of the ethical violations that researchers had long suspected. But document releases are not trials. Archival access is not accountability. The historical record now contains evidence sufficient to condemn the program in moral terms without any official condemnation having occurred. This gap between documented wrongdoing and institutional response constitutes perhaps the program's most troubling legacy. The United States developed during the Cold War a capacity to acknowledge uncomfortable facts in ways that preclude meaningful reckoning with them. Information can be released after sufficient time has passed, when those responsible are dead and circumstances have changed beyond recognition. The release itself becomes a form of closure, a demonstration of transparency that functions to foreclose rather than enable accountability. Paperclip pioneered this approach to managing inconvenient history. The rockets still fly. The principles worked out in wartime Germany and refined in post-war America continue to carry payloads into orbit and beyond. Every launch represents a kind of inheritance, technical knowledge passed from generation to generation of engineers and scientists. The men who first developed these principles are gone. The circumstances that shaped their choices have passed into history. What remains are the capabilities they created and the questions their creation raises about the relationship between scientific progress and moral responsibility. Operation Paperclip: How America Hired Hitler's Scientists, Vertical Bar Sleep Documentary. Part 4, The Closing. In the summer of 1969, a rocket built under the supervision of Wernher von Braun lifted 3 American astronauts toward the moon. The Saturn V stood 363 feet tall. It generated 7.6 million pounds of thrust, and it represented the culmination of a journey that had begun not in the United States, but in a pine forest on the Baltic coast of Nazi Germany. 24 years separated the first V2 launch at Peenemünde from the Apollo 11 mission. In that span of time, the men who had built weapons of terror had become architects of humanity's greatest exploratory achievement, The contradiction sits at the heart of Operation Paperclip. It cannot be resolved. It can only be examined. And in examining it, we confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of nations, the flexibility of morality, and the human capacity to separate a person's usefulness from their past. The story of Operation Paperclip is not simply a Cold War curiosity, it is a mirror, and what we see reflected in it says as much about us as it does about the scientists who crossed the Atlantic with secrets in their minds and blood on their hands. The full scope of Operation Paperclip remained hidden from the American public for decades. The classified files sat in government archives, their contents known only to those with security clearances and institutional memory. Journalists occasionally asked questions. Survivors of concentration camps occasionally raised objections when they encountered a familiar name in a scientific journal. But the machinery of secrecy held. The intelligence agencies had learned their lesson from the early exposés. They buried the connections deeper. They sanitized the records more thoroughly. They waited for the generation that remembered the war to grow old and quiet. It was not until the 1980s and 90s that researchers began to piece together the complete picture. The Freedom of Information Act opened doors that had been sealed for 40 years. Congressional investigations revealed practices that would have caused scandal in any era. And slowly, the names emerged from the shadows. Not just von Braun and Strughold and Rudolph, hundreds of others. Chemists who had developed nerve agents, physicists who had worked on uranium enrichment, engineers who had designed guidance systems for weapons that killed thousands of civilians in London and Antwerp. The scale of the program was larger than anyone outside the intelligence community had known. The declassified documents told a story of systematic deception. They revealed that the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency had not merely overlooked the Nazi affiliations of the scientists. The agency had actively altered records. It had removed evidence of war crimes from dossiers. It had pressured reluctant officials to approve visas. It had lied to the State Department, to the Justice Department, to Congress, and to the American people. The justification was always the same: national security, the Soviet threat, the necessity of winning the next war before it started. And in the calculus of Cold War logic, these arguments carried weight. The Soviet Union did recruit German scientists. The nuclear arms race did accelerate. The space race did become a proxy for ideological competition. The fears were not imaginary, but the question remained: at what cost? What did it mean for a nation that had just fought a war against fascism to embrace the servants of fascism? What did it mean for the victims of Nazi medical experiments to know that the men who had tortured them now lived comfortably in American suburbs, collecting American pensions, receiving American honors? Some of the Paperclip scientists are buried in American soil. They died as American citizens, their obituaries praising their contributions to science and national defense. The newspapers that printed those obituaries rarely mentioned the concentration camps. They rarely mentioned the slave laborers. They rarely mentioned the SS uniforms or the party memberships, or the research conducted on prisoners who had no choice. The scientists had been rehabilitated so thoroughly that their rehabilitation itself had been forgotten. They were simply Americans, contributors to the space program, pioneers of aviation medicine, fathers and grandfathers who attended church on Sundays and barbecued on the 4th of July. The transformation was complete, and perhaps that was the most unsettling aspect of Operation Paperclip. Not that it happened, but that it worked. The program achieved its objectives. The scientists delivered their knowledge. America won the space race. The military gained technologies that shaped warfare for generations. By any instrumental measure, Operation Paperclip was a success. The question is whether instrumental measures are sufficient, whether a nation can judge its actions solely by their outcomes. whether the end can justify the means when the means involve complicity in atrocity. Today, millions of visitors walk through the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum each year. They stand beneath rockets that Wernher von Braun helped design. They read plaques that celebrate the triumph of Apollo. They see the command module that carried Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins to lunar orbit and back. The museum tells a story of American ingenuity, of courage and perseverance, of a nation that set an impossible goal and achieved it within a decade. The story is true, but it is incomplete. The museum does not dwell on the tunnels of Mittelbau-Dora. It does not display photographs of the emaciated bodies stacked outside the Nordhausen complex. It does not explain that the same hands that drafted the blueprints for the Saturn V had once drafted blueprints for weapons that rained death on London. This is not an oversight. It is a choice. A choice about what stories we tell ourselves. A choice about which facts we emphasize and which we allow to fade. Operation Paperclip forces us to confront the selectivity of historical memory. We remember what serves us. We forget what troubles us. And in that forgetting, we risk losing something essential about who we are and what we are capable of becoming. The numbers alone are staggering. 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians brought to the United States under Operation Paperclip and its successor programs. Their collective knowledge accelerated American technological development by years, perhaps decades. They trained a generation of American scientists. They founded research programs that continue today. They shaped the aerospace industry, the pharmaceutical industry, the defense industry. The institutions they built outlasted them. The methods they developed remain in use. The questions they answered opened doors to questions we are still asking. This is their legacy, not simple, not clean. A legacy written in rocket fuel and in blood. A legacy that cannot be separated from the context of its creation. These men were not abstractions. They were individuals who made choices. Some chose to resist the Nazi regime and paid with their lives. Others chose to collaborate and were rewarded with careers and comfort. The Paperclip scientists, by and large, belonged to the second group. They made their peace with evil, and then they made their peace with us. The town of Huntsville, Alabama, still bears the imprint of Operation Paperclip. The streets where the German rocket team lived and worked have become part of the landscape. The Marshall Space Flight Center continues to operate. The legacy of the program is woven into the fabric of the community. Older residents remember the German accents at the grocery store, the unfamiliar foods at the potlucks, the brilliant men who kept to themselves and spoke of things that ordinary people could not understand. The memory is fading now. The Paperclip scientists are gone. Their children have grown old. Their grandchildren know the stories only second-hand, if at all. Time does what it always does. It softens edges. It rounds off corners. It transforms the urgent questions of one generation into the historical curiosities of the next. But the questions themselves do not disappear. They merely wait. They wait for someone to ask them again, to pick up the files and read the names and wonder what it all meant, what it still means. From space, the borders that nations fight over are invisible. The ideologies that drive men to terrible acts cannot be seen. There is only the planet, blue and white and fragile. The rockets that carried human beings to that vantage point were built by engineers who had first built weapons. The journey upward began in a downward spiral of war and cruelty. This is not a comfortable truth, but it is a true one. The same hands can create and destroy. The same minds can conceive miracles and participate in horrors. Human beings are not consistent. They are not predictable. They are capable of holding contradictions within themselves that logic cannot reconcile. Operation Paperclip exploited that capacity. It took men who had served a murderous regime and gave them the opportunity to serve a different purpose. It did not redeem them, it did not punish them, it simply used them, and in using them, it achieved things that might not have been achieved otherwise. Whether that exchange was worth making is not a question with a final answer. It is a question that each generation must ask for itself. The stars are indifferent to the affairs of nations. They burned for billions of years before human beings existed. They will burn for billions of years after we are gone. But for a brief moment in the middle of the 20th century, a species that had just finished the most destructive war in its history looked up at those stars and decided to reach for them. The decision was not pure. It was tangled with fear and ambition and moral compromise. The men who made it possible were not heroes. Many of them were not even good men by any reasonable definition of the word. And yet, the rockets flew, the astronauts walked on the moon. The species took its first steps beyond the planet that had given it birth. Operation Paperclip sits at the center of that achievement, unacknowledged in the celebrations, absent from the triumphant photographs, a shadow history running parallel to the official narrative. The program reminds us that progress is not linear, that advancement does not require virtue, that the future is built by human beings in all their complexity, all their capacity for both greatness and corruption. The Paperclip scientists are gone now. The Cold War that brought them to America has ended. The conflicts that seemed so urgent in 1945 have faded into the long sweep of history. But the questions remain. They will always remain. Because they are not really questions about the past. They are questions about what we are willing to accept, what we are willing to overlook, what price we are willing to pay for the things we want. The answers we give define us, not as Americans or Germans or any other nationality, but as human beings trying to find our way under the same silent stars.